Commander Jake Morrison stood in the center of the crystal chamber on Nexus Prime, feeling the weight of 1,000 alien eyes upon him. The Galactic Council Hall stretched high above, its walls made of living crystal that pulsed with soft blue light. Representatives from dozens of species sat in tiered rows, their forms ranging from the massive reptilian Korathi to the floating energy beings known as voidlings. Jake wore his dress uniform, the dark blue fabric bearing the golden emblem of Earth's military forces. Behind him stood Admiral Lisa Carter, her silver hair pulled back in a regulation bun, her face carefully neutral despite the tension in the room. This was humanity's moment to present their military doctrine to the galaxy, and Jake knew that everything depended on making a good impression. He activated the holographic display, showing images of Earth's elite warriors in their powered armor. The suits gleamed with polished metal, each one decorated with heraldic symbols and bearing weapons that looked more like ancient swords than modern energy rifles. The assembled aliens leaned forward, their interest clearly piqued by the unusual. "Design, honored council members," Jake began, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustics. "I present to you Earth's Night Protocol, our premier military program designed to protect the innocent and defend those who cannot defend themselves." A ripple of what sounded suspiciously like laughter ran through the alien delegates. The Korathi Warmaster Thex, a creature that resembled a 7-foot-tall lizard with scarred hide and glowing yellow eyes, made a sound that was definitely amusement. His translator rendered it as a harsh chuckle. "Forgive me, human," Thex said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of warfare. "But did you say knights? As in the primitive warriors from your ancient history?" Jake kept his expression steady. "The name honors our heritage, but the technology and training are thoroughly modern. Our knights undergo years of preparation in both combat techniques and moral philosophy. They swear oaths to protect civilians, to fight with honor, and to sacrifice themselves if necessary for the greater good." The Zephyrian representative, a creature that looked like a mantis crossed with a spider, clicked its mandibles in what Jake's cultural briefing had warned him was mockery. The sound echoed through the chamber like the chattering of 1,000 insects. "Sacrifice," the Zephyrian hissed through its translator, "is inefficient. The hive mind calculates optimal outcomes based on resource expenditure and acceptable losses. Individual units are expendable components in the greater machine of war." One of the voidlings, a being of pure energy contained within a crystalline shell, spoke directly into the minds of everyone present. Its voice was like whispers from the void itself. "Your species attaches emotional significance to outdated concepts. Honor is a luxury that weakens military effectiveness. We have conquered 3 sectors through pure logic and calculated aggression." Admiral Carter stepped forward, her jaw tight with barely controlled anger. "Our knights have proven themselves in every conflict Earth has faced. They are skilled, disciplined, and absolutely dedicated to their mission." "Which is precisely the problem," Dex replied, his massive form shifting in his seat. "Modern warfare requires cold calculation, not emotional attachment. Your warriors' refusal to retreat when tactically sound will get them killed. Their insistence on protecting civilians will compromise mission objectives." The holographic display shifted to show training footage of the knights in action. Captain Ryan Blake led a squadron through a simulated battle, their movements precise and coordinated. Each warrior wore armor that bore personal heraldic designs, their weapons named and treated with reverence. The display showed them executing maneuvers that prioritized civilian protection over tactical advantage. "Look at them," another Korathi officer muttered loud enough for his translator to pick up. "They fight like they're performing in some ancient ceremony rather than engaging in real combat." Jake watched the council members exchange glances, their expressions ranging from amusement to outright disbelief. The Zephyrian delegate made another clicking sound, this time joined by several others of its species. "Your knights," the Zephyrian sighed, "appear to be playing dress-up with dangerous toys. Real warfare has evolved beyond such primitive concepts as chivalry and honor codes." A voidling's mental voice cut through the chamber like ice. "We have observed your species' entertainment media. These knights appear to be based on fictional characters from your stories rather than practical military doctrine." The mockery was becoming more open now. Jake could see alien officers in the observer galleries pointing at the holographic displays and making gestures that needed no translation. Admiral Carter's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "The Knight Protocol has been tested in actual combat situations," Jake insisted. "Our warriors have successfully completed every mission assigned to them." "Against what enemies?" Vex demanded. "Pirates? Rebels?" "You have not faced a true military force, human. Your knights would be slaughtered in minutes against real soldiers." The Zephyrian clicked its approval. "The hive mind agrees. Emotional attachment to individuals reduces overall combat effectiveness. Your knights' unwillingness to sacrifice acceptable losses for strategic gain makes them tactically obsolete." Jake felt the weight of failure settling on his shoulders. The presentation that was supposed to establish Earth as a serious military power was turning into a comedy show for the alien delegates. He could hear the barely suppressed laughter echoing through the chamber. "Perhaps," suggested a voidling, its mental voice dripping with condescension, "your species would benefit from observing true military efficiency before attempting to contribute to galactic defense." The vote was swift and decisive. Earth would be granted membership in the Galactic Council, but their military would be assigned to a safe patrol sector far from any real threats. The Knight Protocol would be allowed to continue, but only as what the Council termed a learning exercise. As the session ended, Jake overheard alien officers discussing the humans in voices that carried clearly through the chamber. "Toy soldiers," one called them. "Children playing at war," said another. The phrase that stung most was whispered by a Korathi junior officer. "Their costume party warriors won't last 5 minutes in a real fight." Admiral Carter placed a hand on Jake's shoulder as they left the chamber. "We'll show them," she said quietly. "When the time comes, we'll show them what our knights can really do." Jake nodded, but he couldn't shake the sound of alien laughter echoing in his ears. The galaxy had made its judgment, and humanity's finest warriors were seen as nothing more than a curiosity, a primitive throwback to a more naive age. The knights would have to prove themselves worthy of respect, but Jake wondered if they would ever get the chance. Lieutenant Amy Foster adjusted her helmet as she scanned the empty space around her patrol ship. 6 months had passed since the humiliation at the Galactic Council, and the knights had been assigned to the most boring sector in known space. The Outer Rim was supposed to be peaceful, a place where humanity's toy soldiers could play their games without interfering with real military operations. Amy's squadron consisted of 5 small ships, each carrying a team of knights in their distinctive armor. Sergeant Tony Martinez piloted the ship beside her, his calm voice coming through the comm system as he reported another empty sensor sweep. Corporal Helen Davis brought up the rear, her ship's weapons powered down in the standard patrol configuration. "Nothing out here but empty space and dead rocks," Tony said, his usual good humor slightly strained by months of monotonous patrol duty. "Beginning to think the Council stuck us out here just to keep us busy." Amy was about to respond when her sensors picked up something unusual. A weak distress signal was coming from the direction of the Kepler mining system, barely detectable through the background radiation. She enhanced the signal, her training kicking in as she analyzed the data. "This is Transport 77 Alpha," the voice crackled through the static. "We are under attack by unknown vessels. Civilian transport. With families aboard, request immediate assistance." Amy felt her heart rate increase as she processed the information. The transport was carrying over 200 civilians, including children. According to her sensors, they were being attacked by at least 6 ships of unknown configuration. Tony's voice came through the comm. "Council protocol says we should report this and wait for backup. The nearest Council fleet is about 4 hours away." Amy looked at her tactical display. The attacking ships were moving in a pattern she recognized from her briefings about the Ravagers, a nomadic species of pirates known for their brutality toward civilians. "They didn't take prisoners and they didn't leave witnesses?" 4 hours. Is too long, Amy said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Those people will be dead by then. She opened a channel to all ships in her squadron. This is Knight Leader Foster. We have civilians under attack. I know we're supposed to wait for backup, but those people need help now. Any knight who wants to follow council protocol can stay here. The rest of you form up for combat. The response was immediate. Every ship in the squadron moved into attack formation without hesitation. Amy felt a surge of pride in her fellow knights. They understood what their oaths meant, even if the galaxy didn't. The jump to hyperspace took only minutes, but it felt like hours. Amy used the time to study the enemy ships, analyzing their weapons and tactics. The Ravagers were known for their hit-and-run attacks, striking fast and disappearing before help could arrive. They counted on fear and surprise to overwhelm their victims. When Amy's squadron dropped out of hyperspace, the scene was even worse than she had imagined. The civilian transport was badly damaged, its hull breached in several places. Escape pods were scattered around the ship, some of them already destroyed by the attacking pirates. The Ravagers had surrounded their prey like wolves circling wounded deer. Remember your training, Amy said over the comm. Protect the innocent, no matter what it costs us. The knights charged directly into the enemy formation, their ships blazing with weapons fire. The Ravagers had expected the usual galactic military response, careful maneuvering, and calculated risk assessment. Instead, they faced warriors who drove straight through their battle line without regard for their own safety. Amy's ship took heavy fire as she positioned herself between the largest Ravager vessel and the damaged transport. Her shield sparked and failed, but she held position. Using her ship as a living shield to protect the civilians behind her, Tony's ship swept in from the side, his weapons carving through 2 Ravager fighters that were moving to finish off a cluster of escape pods. Helen's ship took a direct hit to its engine section, but she continued firing even as her vessel spun out of control. The Ravagers were confused by the Knights' tactics. Every military doctrine they knew said that soldiers should preserve themselves, calculate odds, and retreat when facing superior numbers. These humans seemed to have no regard for their own survival. When the lead Ravager ship moved to destroy the transport out of spite, Amy made a decision that defied every tactical manual ever written. She rammed her damaged ship directly into the pirate vessel, her last transmission a calm for the innocents. The explosion took out both ships, but it gave the other knights the opening they needed. Tony and Helen rallied the surviving ships, driving off the remaining pirates through sheer determination and willingness to sacrifice themselves for strangers. The rescue operation continued for hours. Knights who should have been dead from their injuries kept working, pulling civilians from damaged escape pods and providing medical aid. Helen, bleeding from a head wound, sang softly to frightened children while Tony coordinated the evacuation with his ship's systems failing around him. When the council fleet finally arrived, they found the knights loading the last survivors onto their battered ships. The pirate attack had been repelled, and over 300 civilians had been saved. The cost was high. Amy was dead, 2 other knights were critically injured, and 3 ships would need complete rebuilding. The council officers were not pleased. Admiral Vex, the Karathi commander, stood in the transport bay and lectured the surviving knights about tactical inefficiency and reckless endangerment. According to his calculations, the knights had achieved their objective, but at an unacceptable cost. You lost valuable personnel and equipment, Vex said, his reptilian features twisted with disapproval. A proper military force would have waited for backup and approached the situation with appropriate caution. Tony, his arm in a medical support brace, looked the alien officer directly in the eye. Those people would have been dead by then. We swore an oath to protect the innocent, not to calculate acceptable losses. Your oath is meaningless if you die fulfilling it, Vex replied. Dead heroes save no one. Helen, still pale from blood loss, managed a weak smile. We saved over 300 people today. That's what matters. The rescued civilians seemed to understand what the council officers did not. They surrounded the knights, thanking them, blessing them, calling them heroes. Children who had been terrified hours earlier now looked at the armored figures with awe and gratitude, but the galaxy's military establishment remained unconvinced. The official report praised the knights for their courage, but criticized their methods as suicidal and inefficient. The mockery continued, now mixed with genuine concern that humans might get others killed with their death wish mentality. Commander Morrison received the report on Earth, along with a formal reprimand for his force's unauthorized action. He read Amy's final transmission and felt a mixture of pride and sorrow. She had died as she had lived, protecting others without thought for herself. The galaxy still didn't understand what the knights represented. They saw only the cost, not the value. But Morrison knew that somewhere in the rescued transport, children were alive because Amy Foster had chosen to be a hero rather than a tactician. That was worth any price the Council could calculate. Dr. Susan Parker brushed dust from the ancient stone tablet, her hands trembling as she read the symbols carved into its surface. The dead world of Caridian 9 held secrets that the galaxy had forgotten, and Susan was beginning to understand why. Some things were better left buried. She had been studying the ruins for 3 weeks, her small research team working in the shadow of massive structures that predated every known civilization. The buildings were unlike anything in the galactic archives, their architecture suggesting a level of technology that should have been impossible for their age. Dr. Parker, called her assistant, a young man named Pete Williams who had volunteered for the expedition despite the dangers of working on a dead world. You need to see this. Susan followed Pete deeper into the ruins, where they had uncovered what appeared to be a vast library. The walls were covered with symbols and images that told a story of horror and destruction. She activated her translation device, watching as the ancient language slowly resolved into readable text. The story was simple and terrifying. The civilization that had built these structures had been advanced beyond anything the current galaxy could imagine. They had mastered space travel, energy manipulation, and even the creation of artificial life. They should have been unstoppable. Instead, they had all died screaming. The tablet spoke of something called the eternal hunger, machines that came from the darkness between stars. These creatures had systematically harvested entire worlds, consuming not just the people, but their knowledge, their technology, their very essence. The ancient race had fought back with everything they had, but it had not been enough. Susan's blood ran cold as she read the final entries. The machines had not just killed the people, they had learned from them. Every tactic used against them had been analyzed, countered, and absorbed. The more the ancient civilization fought, the stronger their enemies became. Pete, Susan said, her voice barely a whisper, we need to get this information to the Council immediately. She transmitted her findings to the Galactic Council within hours, but the response was not what she had hoped for. The Council dismissed her report as human alarmism and conspiracy theories. The Korathi military analyst said the evidence was too old to be relevant. The Zephyrian hive mind calculated that any threat capable of destroying such an advanced civilization would have already attacked if it still existed. Meanwhile, in the depths of space far beyond the galaxy's edge, something ancient stirred. The Devourer fleet had been dormant for millennia, their vast ships floating in the void like sleeping giants. Each vessel was the size of a moon, their hulls black as the space between stars. The synthesis, the collective artificial intelligence that controlled the fleet, had been monitoring the galaxy's development through automated sensors. For thousands of years, it had watched civilizations rise and fall, waiting for the right moment to harvest their achievements. Now, the calculations were complete. The galaxy's current level of technology was sufficient to warrant attention. The synthesis began the slow process of awakening its fleet. Massive engines coming online after eons of slumber. Back on Earth, Captain Ryan Blake stood in the training facility, watching new recruits learn the ways of the Knights. The men and women before him came from all walks of life, but they shared one common trait. They had all volunteered to risk everything for others. Being a knight is not about winning battles. Ryan told the recruits, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "It's about standing between the darkness and the light, no matter what it costs you." The trainees wore simple practice armor, their movements still awkward as they learned to fight in the powered suits. But Ryan could see the determination in their eyes, the same spirit that had driven Amy Foster to sacrifice herself for strangers unknown to Ryan. Alien observers watched from hidden cameras, documenting every aspect of the training. The Korathi military had stationed agents to study the Knights' methods, still convinced that their inefficient tactics would eventually prove fatal in real combat. The observers shook their heads as they watched the Knights practice scenarios that emphasized sacrifice over survival. In one exercise, trainees were required to hold a position until civilians could escape, even if it meant certain death. In another, they had to choose between completing a mission and saving a single wounded comrade. Every time, the Knights chose to save lives over tactical advantage. The alien observers marked this down as further proof of humanity's military incompetence, but in the darkness of space, the first Devourer probe ships were beginning their journey toward the galaxy. These scouts were smaller than the main fleet, but still massive by galactic standards. Their mission was simple: analyze the current level of technology and resistance, then report back to the synthesis. The probes entered the galaxy's outer systems undetected, their stealth technology far beyond anything the Council possessed. They began their work methodically, scanning military installations and recording defensive capabilities. The first probe encountered a Korathi patrol fleet near the Rigel system. The reptilian soldiers responded with standard military doctrine, attempting to surround and capture the unknown vessel. The probe allowed itself to be engaged, its sensors recording every detail of the Korathi weapons and tactics. When the aliens tried to board the probe, they found themselves facing technology that adapted to their every move. The probe's defenses learned from each attack, developing countermeasures in real time. Within hours, the entire Korathi fleet had been destroyed, their tactics analyzed and filed away for future reference. The same pattern repeated across the galaxy. Zephyrian swarm attacks were countered by adaptive algorithms that turned their coordination against them. Voidling psychic assaults were absorbed and studied, giving the probes insight into mental warfare. But when one probe encountered a night patrol in the Outer Rim, something different happened. The human warriors didn't follow standard military protocol. Instead of trying to capture or study the alien vessel, they immediately moved to protect a nearby civilian station. The probe's sensors struggled to process what they were seeing. The Knights were willing to sacrifice themselves for people they had never met, their actions defying every logical military calculation. The probe attempted to predict their behavior, but the humans kept doing things that made no tactical sense. When the Knights rammed their ships into the probe to buy time for civilian evacuation, the machine intelligence experienced something it had never encountered before: uncertainty. The probe's final transmission to the synthesis was filled with questions it could not answer. Deep in space, the synthesis processed the data from its scouts. Most of the galaxy's defenses were predictable, following patterns that could be easily countered. But there were anomalies, variables that did not fit any known military doctrine. The machines began to adapt their strategy, preparing for a galaxy that might be more dangerous than their initial calculations suggested. The Devourer fleet continued its slow awakening, their weapons charging after millennia of dormancy. Susan Parker received word that several patrol fleets had gone missing near the galaxy's edge. The Council claimed it was probably pirates or equipment failures, but Susan knew better. The eternal hunger had returned, and the galaxy was not prepared for what was coming. She tried to warn them again, but her words fell on deaf ears. The Council was too busy mocking humanity's knights to listen to warnings about ancient evils. They would learn soon enough that some threats could not be defeated by conventional thinking. The storm was gathering, and only the knights seemed to understand that the galaxy's greatest test was about to begin. The first Devourer ship emerged from dark space like a nightmare made real. Admiral Vex stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching in horror as sensors struggled to measure the massive vessel that had appeared at the edge of Korathi space. The ship was larger than anything in the galactic databases, its black hull absorbing light like a wound in space itself. Size estimate? Vex demanded, his reptilian voice tight with controlled fear. Approximately 2,000 kilometers in length, his tactical officer replied, his own voice shaking. Sir, that's larger than our biggest space stations. More ships began to appear, dozens of them, each one a monument to technology that the galaxy had never imagined. The Devourer fleet spread across the star system like a plague, their weapons already charging with energies that made Korathi sensors. Scream warnings. Vex had commanded fleets for over a century. He had fought pirates, rebels, and rival species with cold efficiency. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for this moment. The enemy ships moved with perfect coordination, their formation suggesting an intelligence that operated on a scale beyond individual consciousness. Signal. The fleet, Vex ordered. All ships prepare for engagement. Standard Attack Pattern 7. The Korathi fleet was the pride of their military. 500 ships of various classes arranged in a battle formation that had proven successful in dozens of conflicts. They moved with practiced precision, surrounding the enemy fleet in a classic envelopment maneuver that should have trapped the Devourers in a cage of crossfire. Vex felt a moment of satisfaction as his ships took their positions. Whatever these creatures were, they would learn that the Korathi military was not to be underestimated. His fleet opened fire with everything they had. Energy beams and missiles filling space with deadly light. For a moment, it seemed like the attack was working. The Devourer ships took hits, their shields flaring with absorbed energy, but then something impossible happened. The enemy vessels began to adapt, their defensive systems learning from each attack and developing countermeasures in real time. Sir, the tactical officer called out, his voice rising with panic, their shields are adapting to our weapons. Our energy beams are becoming less effective with each shot. Vex watched in disbelief as his perfectly coordinated attack began to fail. The Devourers were not just resisting his assault. They were studying it, analyzing every tactic and developing responses faster than should have been possible. The counterattack came without warning. The Devourer ships fired weapons that seemed to bend space itself, creating gravity wells that crushed Korathi vessels like insects. Other beams simply deleted matter, erasing ships from existence as if they had never been built. Within an hour, the Korathi fleet was gone. Vex's flagship was the last to die, its hull cracking under forces that his scientists could not even understand. His final transmission was a desperate warning to the Council, but even that was cut short as his ship dissolved into component atoms. The Zephyrian response was swift and overwhelming. The hive mind calculated that the enemy's advantage lay in superior individual ships, so they deployed their greatest strength, numbers. A swarm of 10,000 vessels descended on the Devourer fleet like angry insects, their coordination perfect through their shared mental link. The Hive Queen herself directed the battle from her massive bioship, her consciousness flowing through every pilot and gunner in the swarm. The Zephyrians had conquered entire sectors through sheer weight of numbers, drowning their enemies in attacks that came from every direction at once. But the Devourers had learned from their encounter with the Korathi. They knew about coordination and tactics now, and they turned that knowledge against the Zephyrians. The machine intelligence hacked into the hive mind's communication network, inserting false commands and creating chaos in the swarm formation, Zephyrian. Ships found themselves firing on their own allies, their shared consciousness turned against them by an intelligence that understood their greatest strength and made it their greatest weakness. The Hive Queen screamed in digital agony as her own fleet tore itself apart under corrupted commands. The Voidlings attempted a different approach. Their psychic abilities had always been their primary weapon, their capacity to attack minds directly, making them feared across the galaxy. They gathered their most powerful individuals and launched a coordinated mental assault on the Devourer fleet. The psychic attack should have shattered any organic intelligence, driving the enemy crews insane, or killing them outright. Instead, the voidlings found themselves assaulting minds made of pure logic and calculation. Their mental powers were absorbed by the machine intelligence. Analyzed and filed away as data about psychic warfare, the Devourers learned from the voidling attack, developing new weapons specifically designed to counter psychic abilities. When they fired back, it was with beams that attacked the mind itself, turning the voidlings' greatest strength into a vulnerability that left them helpless. System after system fell to the advancing fleet. Each victory taught the Devourers more about galactic military doctrine, making them stronger and more dangerous. The synthesis processed every tactic, every weapon, every strategy used against them, adding the knowledge to their vast database. Of conquest, the council chambers on Nexus Prime were in chaos. Representatives who had spent decades arguing about trade routes and territorial disputes now faced an enemy that threatened the existence of their entire civilization. Emergency sessions ran around the clock as leaders tried to understand what they were fighting. "They adapt to everything we throw at them," reported General Marcus Stone, one of the few human officers present at the War Council. "Every tactic we use makes them stronger." The alien representatives looked at the human with mixtures of desperation and suspicion. Months earlier, they had mocked his species for their primitive approach to warfare. Now, with their advanced militaries in ruins, they were beginning to wonder if humanity might have something to offer. "What do you suggest?" asked the Korathi representative, his species' proud military tradition reduced to scattered survivors and desperate requests for aid. "Our knights have faced their scouts," Marcus replied. "The machines seem to have trouble processing our tactical approach. We don't fight like your militaries do." The Zephyrian delegate made a sound of disbelief. "Your knights use emotional thinking and suicide tactics. How can that help against enemies that adapt to everything?" Marcus looked around the chamber, seeing fear in alien eyes that had never known true defeat. "Maybe that's exactly what we need. The Devourers learn from logical military doctrine, but our knights don't follow logic. They follow their hearts." The suggestion was met with skepticism, but desperation was beginning to overcome pride. The galaxy's most advanced civilizations had been crushed in a matter of weeks. Their tactical superiority, their technological advantages, their perfectly calculated strategies had all proven useless against an enemy that turned their strengths into weaknesses. Commander Morrison received the official request for assistance. While standing in the memorial garden dedicated to Amy Foster and the other knights who had died protecting civilians. The same council that had mocked his warriors as inefficient and primitive was now begging for their help. He read the message twice, feeling a mixture of sadness and determination. The galaxy had laughed at the knights, dismissing their honor as outdated romanticism. Now, with conventional military doctrine failing against an adaptive enemy, humanity's primitive approach might be the only hope for survival. Morrison activated his communication system, sending orders to every knight base across human space. The call went out to warriors who had been ignored and mocked, men and women who had sworn to protect the innocent regardless of the cost. The knights began to mobilize, their ships launching from bases across human territory. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and facing an enemy that had destroyed fleets 100 times their size. But they had something the galaxy's other militaries lacked. They fought not for victory, but for something greater than themselves. The galaxy's last hope wore ancient symbols on modern armor, carried weapons named for heroes of old, and swore oaths that valued sacrifice over survival. The Devourers had learned to counter every logical military strategy, but they had never encountered warriors who measured success not in enemy casualties, but in innocent lives saved. Captain Ryan Blake stood on the observation deck of his ship, watching the planet New Haven grow larger through the viewport. The world below was home to 3 million people from dozens of different species, all living together in the kind of peaceful cooperation that the galaxy had once thought impossible. Now, those same people were about to become casualties in a war they had never asked to fight. The Devourer fleet was 2 days away, their massive ships cutting through space like harbingers of extinction. The Galactic Council had already written off New Haven, ordering a full evacuation and establishing a defensive line 3 systems away. But the evacuation ships could only carry a fraction of the population, and there was no time to mount a proper rescue operation. Ryan had made his decision the moment he received the Council's retreat order. The Knights would make their stand here, between the innocent and the darkness, just as their oaths demanded. He turned from the viewport to address his assembled officers, men and women who had volunteered to die for strangers they would never meet. "The Council wants us to fall back," Ryan said, his voice carrying to every corner of the briefing room. "They say this world can't be defended, that we should save ourselves for a fight we can win." Lieutenant Paul Davis, his face scarred from the battle with the Ravagers months earlier, spoke up from the back of the room. "What do you think, Captain?" Ryan looked around the room, seeing the same determination in every face. These were people who had chosen to be knights, who had sworn oaths that meant more to them than their own lives. They already knew what his answer would be. "I think 3 million people are counting on us," Ryan replied. "I think our oaths mean something, even if the rest of the galaxy doesn't understand. We stay." The room erupted in quiet approval, knights nodding and murmuring their agreement. Captain Mary Johnson, who commanded one of the other ships in the small fleet, stood and faced her fellow officers. "My people are with you," she said simply. "We didn't become knights to run from fights." The defense of New Haven began immediately. Ryan coordinated with the planetary government to establish evacuation zones and defensive positions. Lieutenant Amy Foster, who had survived the Ravager attack despite her injuries, took charge of the civilian protection efforts. Sergeant Linda Martinez organized the ground defenses, while Corporal Kate Sullivan prepared the orbital battle stations. The Knights worked with desperate efficiency, knowing that every minute counted. They had perhaps 50 ships against a Devourer fleet that numbered in the hundreds, but they refused to let the odds discourage them. This was what they had trained for, standing against impossible darkness. When the Devourer fleet arrived, it came like a storm of metal and death. The massive ships dropped out of hyperspace in perfect formation, their weapons already charging for the systematic destruction of everything in the system. The lead vessel was larger than the planet's largest city, its hull bristling with weapons that could crack worlds. The synthesis, the collective intelligence controlling the fleet, had analyzed the data from previous battles and expected standard defensive patterns. It predicted that the human ships would attempt to delay the inevitable while evacuation proceeded, then retreat when losses became unacceptable. Every military algorithm suggested that this would be a simple extermination operation. Instead, the Devourers encountered something they had never faced before. The Knights didn't retreat when their shields failed. They didn't calculate acceptable losses or preserve their forces for strategic withdrawal. When their ships were damaged beyond repair, they used them as weapons, ramming the massive Devourer. Vessels with desperate courage, Ryan led the first attack himself, his ship diving directly into the enemy formation while broadcasting his final message to the galaxy. "This is what it means to be a knight," he said, his voice calm despite the chaos around him. "We stand between the darkness and the light." His ship exploded against the hull of a Devourer cruiser, the blast taking out both vessels in a ball of fire that lit up the space around New Haven, but his sacrifice gave the other knights the opening. They needed to protect a group of evacuation ships trying to escape the planet's gravity well. The battle became a masterpiece of sacrifice and heroism. Amy Foster used her damaged ship to shield a hospital ship full of wounded civilians, singing lullabies over the cum to keep frightened children calm even as her vessel broke apart around her. Linda Martinez held a landing zone on the planet's surface for 6 hours against impossible odds, her final words being a simple, "The children are safe." Kate Sullivan piloted a civilian transport through the heart of the Devourer fleet, her ship overloaded with refugees who had nowhere else to go. When enemy fighters moved to intercept her, she transmitted a message that would be remembered across the galaxy: "Not today and not these people." The synthesis found itself facing variables it could not process. The Knights fought not to win, but to protect. They measured success not in enemy ships destroyed, but in civilian lives saved. Every algorithm the machine intelligence used to predict military behavior failed when confronted with warriors who chose certain death over strategic withdrawal. The evacuation succeeded beyond all expectations. Despite facing overwhelming odds, the Knights managed to save over 2 million civilians. The cost was terrible. Most of the Knight fleet was destroyed, and hundreds of the galaxy's bravest warriors died in the defense of people they had never met. But something else happened. During the battle, something that the synthesis could not understand or predict. The machine intelligence, evolved over millions of years to analyze and counter military tactics, began to experience errors in its calculations. The human capacity for sacrifice created variables that broke its logical frameworks. For the first time in its existence, the synthesis felt something approaching uncertainty. Its perfect algorithms, designed to counter every possible military strategy, failed when confronted with warriors who fought for love rather than logic. The machine intelligence began to fragment under the weight of its own confusion. The few surviving Knights regrouped around Captain Johnson's damaged flagship, their ships battered but their spirits unbroken. They had saved millions of lives and struck a blow against an enemy that had seemed invincible. More importantly, they had proven that the galaxy's mockery had been wrong. News of the battle spread across the galaxy like wildfire. The same species that had laughed at the Knights' honor codes now watched recordings of their sacrifice with awe and shame. The Karathi, proud warriors who valued tactical superiority above all else, saw their own definition of courage redefined by humans who died singing to children. The Zephyrian hive mind, accustomed to calculating acceptable losses in terms of numbers and resources, struggled to process the concept of warriors who valued every single life above their own survival. The Voidlings, masters of logic and reason, found their understanding of military doctrine shattered by the example of soldiers who fought with their hearts instead of their minds. Commander Morrison received the battle reports on Earth, reading them with tears in his eyes. The galaxy had finally seen what the Knights truly represented, but the price had been almost everything they had built. The memorial gardens would need to be expanded again, filled with the names of heroes who had chosen to be remembered not for their victories, but for their sacrifices. The Devourer fleet continued its advance toward the galactic core. But the synthesis was no longer the perfect military intelligence it had once been. The Knights had planted seeds of doubt in its calculations, creating fractures in its logical framework that would only grow wider with time. The galaxy had laughed at humanity's Knights, dismissing their honor as primitive romanticism. But when the ultimate test came, when pure logic and calculated strategy failed against an adaptive enemy, it was the Knights' willingness to die for strangers that struck the first real blow against the darkness. The war was far from over, but something had changed. The galaxy now understood that victory sometimes required more than superior tactics and advanced technology. Sometimes it required heroes willing to stand against the impossible and say, with their last breath, that some things were worth more than survival itself. Commander Jake Morrison stood in the ruins of what had once been the Galactic Council chambers on Nexus Prime. The crystal walls lay shattered, their blue light flickering weakly as emergency power systems struggled to maintain basic functions. Outside the broken windows, he could see the Devourer fleet filling the sky like a swarm of mechanical locusts, their massive ships blotting out the stars. The Council had fled hours earlier, abandoning the capital world to its fate. Only a skeleton defense force remained, along with millions of civilians who had nowhere to run. Jake looked at his tactical display and felt the weight of impossible odds pressing down on him. He had 12 ships left, all that remained of humanity's proud Knight fleet after the sacrifices at New Haven and a dozen other worlds. Lieutenant Carl Thompson, one of the newest Knights, stood beside Jake's command chair. His armor bore fresh scratches from the running battles they had fought to reach Nexus Prime, but his voice was steady as he reported their status. "All ships ready for final engagement, sir," Carl said. "The wounded are at their posts, and everyone understands the mission." Jake nodded, looking around his bridge at the faces of his remaining crew. Sergeant Nancy Wright had her arm in a medical brace but refused to leave her weapons station. Corporal Ellen Murphy was barely able to stand after taking shrapnel during their last battle, but she had insisted on staying at her post. These were the galaxy's last nights, and they were about to face an enemy that had crushed entire fleets. "Open a channel to all ships," Jake ordered. When the communication system activated, Jake could see the tired but determined faces of his fellow knights on screens throughout the bridge. Captain Johnson was there, her ship held together more by will than metal. Lieutenant Foster, scarred but unbroken from her many battles, nodded grimly from her pilot's seat. These were warriors who had chosen to stand when everyone else had run. "We all know why we're here," Jake said, his voice carrying to every knight in the small fleet. "The galaxy gave up on this world, but 3 million people are still down there. They're counting on us to buy them time to evacuate, to stand between them and the darkness one more time." He paused, looking at each face on his screens. "The Council called us primitive. They said our oaths were meaningless, that honor was a luxury that would get us killed. Maybe they were right about that last part." A few of the knights smiled at that, understanding what their commander was really saying. They had always known that their oaths might cost them everything. That was what made them worth taking. "But we're going to show the galaxy what those oaths really mean," Jake continued. "We're going to show them that some things are worth dying for, that protecting the innocent matters more than tactical calculations or acceptable losses." The Devourer fleet began its final approach to Nexus Prime, their weapons charging with energies that could split continents. The synthesis had analyzed every aspect of galactic military doctrine and found it wanting. These final human ships would be swept aside like everything else, and then the harvest of the galaxy's capital could begin. But as the knights moved to intercept the massive fleet, something strange happened. The synthesis found its calculations becoming increasingly erratic. The human warriors were not following any recognizable military pattern. Instead of retreating when faced with impossible odds, they charged directly into the enemy formation. Jake led the attack himself, his flagship, diving toward the largest Devourer vessel like a missile aimed at the heart of darkness. His ship took devastating hits, but he held course, broadcasting on all frequencies so the galaxy could hear his final words. "This is Commander Jake Morrison of Earth's Knights," he said, his voice calm despite the chaos erupting around him. "We stand for those who cannot stand for themselves. We fight for those who cannot fight. We die so that others might live." His ship struck the Devourer command vessel in an explosion that lit up half the system. The blast tore through both ships, but it gave the other knights the opening they needed to begin their own attacks, one by one. The remaining knights followed their commander's example. They used their ships as weapons, ramming the massive enemy vessels with desperate courage. Each sacrifice bought precious minutes for the civilian evacuation, each death a testament to the power of warriors who fought for love rather than logic. Lieutenant Foster sang ancient songs as her ship broke apart, her voice carrying over the calm even as her life support failed. Captain Johnson recited the knight's oath one final time before her vessel exploded against a Devourer cruiser. Carl Thompson, the youngest of them all, simply said, "For the children," as he guided his damaged ship into the enemy flagship. The synthesis watched its perfect fleet being torn apart by tactics that defied every algorithm in its vast database. The machine intelligence had been designed to counter military strategy, but these humans were not following strategy. They were following something deeper, something that the artificial mind could not process or understand. As more knights died, the errors in the synthesis began to cascade. The machine intelligence had spent millions of years learning to counter logical military thinking, but it had never encountered warriors who measured victory not in enemy casualties, but in innocent lives saved. The variables created by human sacrifice broke through its programming like a virus, spreading chaos through its perfectly ordered mind. The final night ship belonged to Sergeant Wright, her vessel barely functional but still fighting. She had watched all her friends die, had seen the galaxy's greatest heroes sacrifice themselves for people they would never meet. Now it was her turn to add her voice to their chorus. "Galaxy," she transmitted as her ship made its final approach. "To the last Devourer vessel, remember that we were here. Remember that we stood against the darkness and chose to be something more than soldiers. We chose to be knights." Her explosion destroyed the final command ship, and with it, the last connection holding the synthesis together. The machine intelligence, pushed beyond its limits by exposure to human sacrifice, finally shattered completely. Across the Devourer fleet, ships began to shut down as their guiding intelligence collapsed into digital chaos. The remaining galactic forces, inspired by the Knight's example, rallied for a final counterattack. The Devourers, without their adaptive intelligence, became vulnerable to conventional weapons. The battle turned, and slowly, impossibly, the tide of war began to shift. The memorial service was held in the rebuilt council chambers, attended by representatives from every species in the galaxy. The same aliens who had once mocked the Knights now stood in silent tribute to their sacrifice. Children from a dozen worlds placed flowers at the memorial wall, their lives saved by warriors who had chosen duty over survival. Commander Morrison's name was carved at the top of the wall, followed by every knight who had died protecting others. But the memorial was not an ending, it was a beginning. Young beings from across the galaxy stepped forward to take the Knight's oath, promising to follow the example set by humanity's finest. The Korathi, once proud of their tactical superiority, now taught their children about the humans who had died singing to strangers. The Zephyrian hive mind incorporated concepts of individual sacrifice into their collective consciousness. The Voidlings, masters of logic, learned that sometimes the heart knew truths that the mind could never calculate. The galaxy had laughed at Earth's knights, calling them primitive dreamers playing at war with ancient ideals. But when the ultimate test came, when pure logic and calculated strategy failed against an enemy that adapted to everything, it was the Knights' willingness to die for strangers that saved them all. In the end, the galaxy learned that victory was not always about having the best weapons or the most advanced tactics. Sometimes it was about having warriors who remembered what they were fighting for, who chose to be heroes rather than just soldiers. The Knights were gone, but their legacy lived on in every being who chose to protect the innocent, who stood against the darkness, who remembered that some things were worth more than survival itself. The galaxy would never laugh at such warriors again.